If you've listened to Brewlosophy at all, you know how much we love Imperial Yeast. The company was founded on the ideal that if you're going to do something, do it right. From their Imperial Pitch-Right pouches, packing a whopping 200 billion cells of healthy and viable yeast in each pouch, to their commitment to commercial customers, guaranteeing 10 of their most popular strains are in stock for orders up to 20 liters, or the shipping is free, Imperial Yeast does it right. No more worrying about whether you need to make a starter or propagate your yeast prior to pitching. Imperial Yeast makes it easy for the home brewer and commercial brewer to obtain direct pitches at proper rates when you need it. To place a commercial order or to get more information about everything that Imperial Yeast has to offer, head on over to imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. Hops are added to beer for a variety of reasons, but in styles like Pale Ale and IPA, hops are prized for their aromatic contribution to beer flavor, which ranges from herbal, earthy, and spicy to fruity and tropical. The latter, tropical, is heavily influenced by the presence of free thiols. Where do thiols come from and how do they get into beer? That's the question I asked Dr. Cécile Chenot and Guillaume Willemart from the Université Catholique in Belgium. I'm your host, Cade Job, and today I'm back in the lab with my co-host Jordan Folks as we apply the science from last week's episode, Enzymatic Release of Bound Thiols in Hops. Jordan, welcome back to the Brew Lab.
You know, every year it seems there's some new topic that everyone's talking about in the brewing world, and I swear 2023 is the year of thiols.
I mean, for me, it feels like it's been 2020 and 2021 and 2022. But a lot of the cool research is coming out now, right? And that's what's been fun to see. I mean, we've heard about new thiolized yeast strains from Omega. We're talking about, the Berkeley Yeast Tropics GMOs. You're looking at Omega, at Imperial doing fun stuff with thiols and organic yeasts. So it's been really cool to talk about thiols, and I really enjoy talking about thiols. It's a super hot research topic, and the research from Cécile and Guillaume, who are out of Dr. Sonia Colin's lab, it's really cool, and it helps us understand sort of the basic chemistry of thiols and hops, and we won't go down as far into the weeds as we did in that episode, because again, the whole point of this show is to apply the science, but it's still pretty cool stuff, right?
Yeah, and I think that we're getting a better understanding of some kind of rule of thumb ways to, maximize thiol content, but really understanding where that comes from, the chemical processes as to how that happens is only going to help us as an industry continue to grow that part of the scene and make even better thiol beers. Because I think that bigger isn't necessarily better with some of these things, and really understanding how to dial it in is going to be key going forward.
Yeah, exactly. Learning how to dial it in. And also it's really interesting to think about. I mean, this is a little bit of a teaser, but y'all have already listened to the show. Like the thing with hop teas, right? Where they're like, oh, maybe we could pre-treat the hops. I was thinking about that going like, that's exactly what a brewer would do, right? If they're trying to figure out how to maximize thiol character, they'd go, maybe there's a way that we can get these thiols into a solution before putting it into the beer. But anyway, we'll talk about those results. And again, the last episode was some pretty complicated scientific topics that I intentionally left complicated and scientific because, one, I think there's a lot of people that love that sort of stuff like me, who sort of nerd out on the structure of thiols. But also knowing that Jordan and I are going to break it down and talk about our experiences, how to use it, what our experiences have been with thiols, how we increase or maximize thiol character. So I think we've got a lot to discuss in this episode. But first, if you're not already a patron of Brewlosophy, please consider becoming one. We really appreciate the support from our patrons. And as a reward, you get awesome rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session. That's in addition to all the great content that we continue to provide for free, like the Experiment series on the website, 2 podcasts each week, and the new Brewlosophy show on YouTube. We're able to keep doing all this because of our awesome patrons, so seriously, if you're not a patron, I'd really love for you to become one. Just visit patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another super easy way to support us is by using those partner affiliate links at brewlosophy.com/support. Start your shopping experience by clicking the link and we get a small kickback. Every single little bit helps, and it doesn't change your shopping experience at all. So all you have to do is go check out those links at brewlosophy.com/support. This week's feedback is brought to you by the dedicated crew at Haas, who bred Sabro from Neo-Mexicanus species growing wild in the mountains of New Mexico. Think you know Sabro? Think again. This monster of a hop is efficient when it comes to delivering big flavor. Use less green to save more green, if you know what I mean. And if you like pina coladas and getting caught in the rain, try it in the whirlpool. It's full of aroma and chemical compounds that last from the hot side to the final glass, even if you dry hop on top of it. Sabro's known for its incredible blend of coconut, tropical, and stone fruits with pronounced cream character, flavors of vanilla, cedar, dill, and even mint. Can't decide where to use it? No sweat. Sabro's available in all Haas hop formats to meet your brewing needs, from highly consistent Lupa Max pellets to efficient Incognito and traditional T90 pellets. Learn more about this awesome variety as well as the other innovative products Haas has to offer at johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, Haas.com. All right, listener Adam wrote in with a question for you, Jordan. He says, "Hey, Cade, love the show. Was just listening back to some older episodes of the Brew Lab and Jordan talking about the Oshbody win. He said, I've brewed a few lambics over the last few years, and they are sour as hell." Jordan had mentioned that he makes a mixing stock to mix back into his wild sour beers to make them less sour. Obviously, would love to try this in order to try to mix them into a less sour but delicious concoction. I'm just a bit nervous about doing so since I don't want to leave too much left for the bugs and Brett, resulting in bottle bombs. Do you happen to know which yeast Jordan uses to ferment down to an acceptable gravity? Also, how does one go about mixing these styles without oxidizing the crap out of the beer? Cheers. Cheers, Adam.
Yeah, this is definitely a common problem when it comes to homemade sour beers. And I can definitely have the same experience where they just come out sour as hell. And so a pH meter is your friend here. You know, I've seen things naturally on their own go down below 3. And in my opinion, that's just too sour. And so I like to target 3.2, 3.3, 3.4, 3.5, something like that. And I think that blending in some non-sour stock is a really good strategy. It also has the other benefit of a freshening effect. You know, aged sour beers, they can be a year old plus, and a little bit of fresh beer really helps liven it up and makes it a more enjoyable experience. So when it comes to proper lambic, we're talking spontaneously soured beers. And so one way to go about that would be to blend in some fresh lambic that's still fairly dry and is not going to be as sour. I don't know if the listener, Adam, is necessarily using a spontaneous approach. My guess is he's probably using laboratory cultures. And so in a world where you're not trying to truly replicate the Belgian Goose tradition, where you're only using spontaneous beers in your blend, you're not breaking any rules when you're using Saison. But if you're trying to follow the rules, the method traditional, I would say you want to use some young lambic. But a fun blend you can actually do, I think, maybe Block 15 turned me onto this. I think it was a Block 15 and Delgard collab, two amazing Oregon breweries, as you know. Mm-hmm. They did a blend of like 50-50 spontaneous beer with Saison. It was so good. And so that's a really not traditional, but fun lambic blend that I can recommend for sure. So I think in general, any sort of dry beer is going to work here. And the obvious approach there is going to be a diastaticus strain. Your Saison strains, your Trappist strains, whatever strain you're going to use is fine. Just get that as dry as possible. You could use some sugar, you could mash low, just encourage attenuation. If your FG is below 10.05, it's probably dry enough. If you're going to do some fruiting, that's going to further attenuate and give a chance for those remaining sugars to be eaten in that re-fermentation process on the fruit. As long as you're using a thick brown Belgian bottle, you got some wiggle room here, and it's okay if you have another couple gravity points of attenuation in the bottle. So I wouldn't be too worried about it. Just make it as dry as you can with the diastaticus strain. If I'm running out of, fresh Saison or a Brett Saison or something, I'll even blend in a little bit of Pilsner, because that fruit re-fermentation phase or a thick brown bottle, it's going to absorb some of that additional attenuation. So in terms of mixing these styles without oxidizing the crap out of them, it's tough on a homebrew level. And so this is what I do. I have actually constructed a little CO2 bubbler. So I took a oxygen stone and attached that to a tube. And on the other end, I used I went to the homebrew store and got the appropriate screw piece so I can screw that into my CO2 line. And so I actually bubble CO2 into the mixing vessel during the transfer. And I'll use a closed transfer approach or semi-close transfer approach to push the blend out of the vessels into the bottling bucket or the carboy that you're going to do your fruiting in, right? So you push your liquid out via CO2, and whatever vessel you're collecting it in, you're bubbling CO2 out in there. But a bottle re-fermentation, a fruit re-fermentation are going to further scavenge some of that oxygen. So I think this is a really good opportunity to, bust out the bottling kit and bottle some beers, because that'll also give you additional insurance there.
Yeah, I love it. And I don't have anything else to add. So thanks, Adam, for this awesome question, and Jordan for the feedback. So after this short break, we'll be back talking about the enzymatic release of bound thiols from hops. The dry yeast revolution is here, and Cellar Science is leading the charge. Cellar Science has expanded the world of dry yeast far beyond the drab landscape of yesteryear. With over 20 strains of beer and wine yeast now available, you can brew any style. Not to mention that their unique growth and harvesting process greatly increases lipid levels in yeast cell walls, removing the need to aerate your wort on the first pitch and allowing you to directly pitch without rehydration. Couple that with the other advantages of dry yeast, such as higher cell count and viability, and you can clearly see why commercial breweries across the U.S. are using dry yeast and choosing Cellar Science. I've come to associate the distinctly tropical passion fruit, guava, and mango aromas of many modern IPAs with thiols, and having tasted many beers brewed to increase thiol character, I've started to notice this character even outside of IPAs when hops are used with a lighter hand, even in pale ales or even lightly hopped blonde ales, but hops that are prominent in this tropical fruity thiol character. How about you, Jordan? Have you started to recognize thiol character in beers?
Well, you've already made me think of a few questions for you as a response to that. So first question, are thiols present in every single beer as long as hops are used?
That's a great question. I don't know, but my guess is yes, right? Because I think a lot, so thiols aren't necessarily made to smell great, right? Like the hops don't need good smelling thiols. So what they do need though is sulfur metabolism. And so the precursors to thiols help them consume and metabolize sulfur. So I think that's exactly what, that's the point. So I would think most hops have it. And there may be in some level across all varieties some amount of thiols. I don't know that for sure. Again, this is just sort of me talking out of my spitballing here. But yeah, I think that most hops do.
Right. So if beers inherently have some level of thiol character, and we know that they're present in hops, there are free thiols in hops, and maybe some varieties have more free thiols than others. Ostensibly, IPAs have more thiol character, even before we start to look into genetically modified ways to bring in additional thiol character.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you're just dumping in more free thiols, right, you're increasing the concentration. Yeah, because IPAs are generally, right, maybe a whirlpool edition, maybe not, but definitely a dry hop edition where you're just adding in a huge amount of, whatever solubilizes into the wort. Right.
And the survivable compounds, are those thiols?
There's a lot of survivable compounds, but yeah, the SH, so the thiol, what makes it a thiol, the OL, thiol, is a sulfur bonded to a hydrogen. And anytime you hear anything bonded to a hydrogen, that means it's soluble in water and thus soluble in beer. So those are survivable for sure. The free versions, right? The bound versions also probably are pretty soluble in beer. They just may not have an aroma or sensory impact.
Right. And maybe in a second, you can kind of explain the difference between like what is a bound thiol and how do you unbind it, perhaps in a brief answer. But I was struck by, I think you asked them, do you all like thiol beers? And they said the last 5 years in Belgium, they've been really popular. And I think there's a critical distinction in terms of the brewing process and the enjoyment factor for a drinker of a beer is a normal IPA or other type of beer that has some sort of free thiol content, and a beer that has unlocked and exposed and solubilized bound thiols. Mm-hmm. And so I do like IPAs, but the thiolized beers that are using like GMO'd yeast or Phantasm grape powder to really bring new previously bound thiols into the flavor experience, I'm kind of so on them. And I find that these like unbound, exposed thiols are kind of weird to my palate. And I definitely prefer a defter, lighter touch on them. And so when they said they've been really popular over the last 5 years, I wonder if they just meant the free thiols that we kind of naturally see in IPA brewing. Because like, really, are Belgian brewers doing a bunch of like GMO'd thiolized yeast that are changing the market landscape there? Well, like, surely not.
No, but they are using yeasts that are high in beta lyase, right? So Belgian yeasts are very high in beta lyase, or at least that's sort of my understanding. So they had this sort of untapped potential, but Belgians weren't generally using hops that much, right? Like you mentioned earlier, lambics and gooses, there's no hops in those. Also, one thing real quick, I want to be careful as well. So the term thiolized, the use of that term, that's actually trademarked by Omega yeast. So when we talk about a yeast being thiolized, it has to refer to Omega yeasts, like their Cosmic Punch and all that strain of GMO yeast that they've got out there. Thiol releasing yeast, or yeast that that use enzymes or other ways to that have high beta lyase activity, for example, those are thiol releasing yeast. So just want to be a little careful of using that term in the future. And for anybody out there, that's interesting information, right? To know. But back to your point, I think that's interesting that Belgians are starting to taste more thiolized beers because they're starting to use more hops. I mean, Belgians traditionally didn't use many hops, right?
Well, I want to correct you there. Lambic and goose production uses a heck ton of hops.
Really?
But they're aged. Yeah, they're aged hops, right? So the pounds per barrel is fairly high, but the alpha acid is like nil. And so that's one of the reasons we think that Lambic goose needs some time in barrel, is for that, like, the cheesy kind of hop stuff to volatilize off. It's a pretty gross, bitter substance at first, not to mention all of the long-term spontaneous fermentation chemistry that's happening, but they actually use a lot of hops. But I know that there's some interest in modern varieties in Belgian brewing, both here and abroad. And pro tip, Nelson Saison kicks ass. I've really enjoyed the beers that I've made using Nelson and Belgian Saison strains, and I'm wondering if there's some, forgive the trademark infringement, some thiolization that's happening there.
Yeah, right. Some thiol releasing that's happening. And Nelson Sauvin, right? Nelson Sauvin. This is one of the things, if you talk to the scientists who are doing thiol research in hops, we're often looking to the wine industry for the Sauvignon Blanc, which is out of New Zealand. Nelson Sauvin, Sauvignon, that's from the same growing region. Nelson is actually where the hops are grown, and then Sauvignon Blanc is where those grapes are from. Where those grapes are from. When we're looking at thiol research, oftentimes we're looking at wine and those white wines, because if you've tasted a Sauvignon Blanc, you know immediately what thiol character is. I mean, it's in your face. It's passion fruit. It's guava. It's a little bit of stinky overripe fruit sometimes. But that's that thiol character. And so, before we get too off in the weeds, just sort of pontificating about thiols, which we're going to do a lot on this show, I did want to mention, about what Cecile and Guillaume and Dr. Cullen were looking at whenever they were looking at this thiol release. And what they wanted to understand is how to release bound thiols from its precursors in hops. And I think, if I remember correctly, Cecile sort of said, hey, there are free thiols in hops, which is great because those free thiols go immediately into solution. And that's where, just dry hopping with beer, you'll get some thiol character if you're using a high free thiol yeast. But there's 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 times, or maybe even 20 times. I can't remember exactly what the number was, but there's a huge number of bound thiols that are just totally going underutilized in yeast. So of those bound thiols, yeasts are only releasing 0.8%. So there's just this huge untapped potential of bound thiols. And their research was one of the first ones that I saw that really went into detail about what factors affect the enzymatic release of these bound thiols. And that's what I thought was really cool about their research. And again, we can get into the structure and nerd out a little bit on that if we want to. I nerded out with them on it, and I'll probably still nerd out on this show because that's me. But that's the big takeaways for me from the show, is all of these different factors that they looked at. Does the enzyme itself matter? Is it beta lyase or, tryptophanase or Cysta, which was the other one. Or does it matter if you're in model media versus beer versus hop tea? What about the presence of a cofactor like PLP, or what about the pH, and does it need an acceptor, and all these other sort of, scientific things? But at the end of the day, the whole thing is in getting to this untapped potential in hops and releasing these great thiol character, which I thought was really interesting.
You said tryptophanase. Isn't that what's in turkey that allegedly makes us sleepy after Thanksgiving dinner? Tryptophan?
Right. I think, tryptophan, I think is an amino acid. Yeah. So, but it's apotryptophanase was what they called the apo, and then Cysta, which I didn't write down, but I'll find it here in a little bit, and I'll come back in with that. But those were the two enzymes that they were looking at that would actually release thiols from their bound precursors, or at least would assist with that release. So this was a pretty technical episode. There were a lot of terms and definitions. I mean, cis adducts and cysteine and glutathionated and all these words. I'm sure a lot of people rolled their eyes, but for the nerdy scientists like me, I'm sure there were a bunch of people that are like, "Wow, this is really cool." The main thing there's two sort of like really high level concepts that I felt like we did a really good job of talking through with Cecile and Guillaume, but it also needs to be like repeated. It's like, what is a thiol and what are free versus bound thiols, right? Because that's what we're sort of getting at here. So again, I mentioned at the top of the show, a thiol is just an SH. It's some molecule attached to an SH, and that SH is what makes it soluble in beer and wort, and that's why we taste it in beer. And there's a whole bunch of different thiols, like thiols that we like 3MH, which tastes kind of like currants, and guava passion fruit. 3MHA, which is an acetate ester of 3MH, which also tastes sort of, fruity and tropical and passion fruity. But then there's other thiols that we don't like one that you know of, Jordan, 3MBT, 3-methylbutylthiol, which is skunky, right? That's also a thiol. Garlic and onion are also sulfur-related compounds that may not be a thiol, but again, may form this disulfide bridge or anything. But anyway, that's way more difficult that we need to get to, but sulfur compounds play a huge range of flavors and aromas in beer.
So the skunk one, does that mean that light struck activates that? How does that work?
Yeah. It's just a different pathway, right? So there's different different precursors, right? Because you can have any molecule attached to that SH can be a thiol. Right. So there can be a whole bunch of different molecules that are attached to it. When you get the light struck character, energy from light is actually breaking up the precursor and releasing the stinky thiol. Is an easy way to think about it, right? So light is interacting with a hop acid, and that's causing this break of the thiol that's releasing off this skunky character. But it's kind of the same way if you're looking at like what we're talking about is releasing bound thiols. Bound thiols are thiols that are attached to another molecule that renders it sensorially inert or aromatically inert, right? It's in there, but you wouldn't be able to taste it. The humans wouldn't be able to taste it. When you break apart that molecule and break off the aromatic sulfur compound, boom, suddenly you've got guava and passion fruit and mango, or in the case of light struck, stinky and skunky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's those bound ones I'm just not so sure they're for me. And so one thing I'm wondering is like, what's the real market potential for this stuff? Like, I know brewers are nerding out on it, but does the average consumer care? Do they like it? Do they understand it? And this is one thing I think that's kind of interesting from a marketing perspective, right? Is you're starting to see some of this stuff make it to like the label on the can. Mm-hmm. And like I was in the Memphis airport the other day, and it said like Kavik Pilsner. It's like, everyone at this airport bar is ordering Bud Light. Like, you think they understand like Kavik? Right. And so it's an interesting thing as we kind of dive into this is like, what's the true market potential here? And so in terms of enjoyment factor, are you a big fan of the bound thiol release beers?
Well, so yes and no. I think with anything, in the right proportions, it's good, right? But I think one of the issues is like, this is something that I learned about, DMS, right? Everyone's, or no, it's not DMS. Which one is it that's cooked corn? Yeah, DMS, right? cooked corn, right? Everyone says, DMS, cooked corn, DMS, cooked corn. And that's what it smells like. It's never smelled like cooked corn for me. It's always smelled like tomato paste or something. But if you change the concentration of DMS from low to high, it starts to smell like cooked corn for me. It's just a much higher concentration than what we would normally call like threshold tasting in the beer. So like finally, at some point, I like super spiked a beer with DMS and I was like, oh, there's cooked corn. That's what that actually smells like. So like that with Thiols, as we release more and more Thiols, maybe we're moving out of this passion fruit and guava like nice character into like composting vegetable character, which is sometimes what I get from those Thiol beers.
Yeah, I made one that was like super thiolized using Omega yeast, and I did every little trick you could possibly look up to maximize thiol character, and it was like drinking a Band-Aid. And
wow, that bad.
Yeah, and I reached out to Scott Janish and Lance, and they're like, yeah, you got to be careful with the, maybe there's a point of no return. And so on the flip side, I had a friend that made a couple thiolized beers using the Omega strain, and he didn't do anything to maximize thiol character other than using the yeast. One was a hazy IPA and one was a spruce beer. They were fantastic. And so for me, my palate personally, I think that maybe going on a lighter touch is the way to go with some of these products. But, Omega released a super thiolized strain that some like logarithmic increase in terms of the number of bound thiol volume it's able to release. And so, different strokes for different folks, but I think I'm somewhere on the lower end personally.
Yeah, sure. I mean, definitely different strokes for different folks, for sure. Some people, it was interesting too. I'm reminded of Ricky Molitor's study that he did while we were here at Oregon State, which was looking at a whole bunch of different strains that were GMO modified with Berkeley yeast. And we talked about in that episode of the podcast, of the Brew Lab podcast, how, some of those beers were fantastic. There were like no hops. The only hops were added in the boil in this. And so some of those beers were fantastic. They tasted great because also this is another thing we mentioned in the episode, and Cecile has written a paper on that we're going to talk about, is there's a huge amount of thiols in malt too, not in hops. So that's going to be fun to get into. But in Ricky's, we were talking about some of the beers were great. And then some of the beers were like, oh, this tastes like compost or like vegetables or something that's over the top. So I'm wondering too, I think there's going to be individual preference, but also, yeasts that do different things. I mean, Berkeley has that thiol boost, which they add with tropics, right? And when I had Nick Harris on the show a few months back, he talked about like, if you use thiol boost with a regular strain, it's not going to do a lot. But if you use thiol boost with one of their tropics strains, which is their GMO thiol strain, you're going to get a punch you in the face level of thiol character out of those beers. And people love Sauvignon Blanc, right? People love that version of white wine. So I think there's definitely going to be room for it out there. And again, like anything, for me, I'm all about balance. If it's balanced and like everything's like nicely playing together, then awesome. But yeah, you get over that. You can go off the cliff easily on this stuff.
Well, and that's why this is such a fun topic for brewers right now, is this is the Wild West of this stuff. And so from the biggest production brewery to the smallest 1-gallon stovetop home brewer, we're all still experimenting. And really anyone could make the next big discovery of like how to make this stuff like really lock it in and make it really taste good. So Cade, maybe we can talk a little bit about what we know about thiols, how to access and unlock some of the bound thiols and from kind of an applied setting. So starting at the beginning of the brewing process, I understand that mash hopping is one such strategy. Well, actually, taking a step back, you said the mash. There are certain malts, you can unbound bound thiols from malt. And as I've learned, under-modified malts may have more bound thiols present.
Yeah, and so again, you asked if all hops have sulfur or thiols present in them, and I would sort of expand that out even to a macro level. Most plants are going to have some version of these in there because of that sulfur metabolism. So malt, again, has one. Now, that's not all plants, and maybe not even most plants. Again, Cade's not a botanist. So if that's not the case, write in with feedback and I'll read it on the show. But again, getting getting those thiol bound precursors into the wort is something that I don't know anything about yet. But again, I'm excited to learn this from Cecile, because she did this also looking at grapes and malt. So that's basically just a sugar source, right? No hops added at all, and you can get thiols into wort. And that's very similar again to what Ricky was doing with those GMO yeasts in his study. Is again very little hops only added in the boil, and then GMO yeast later. Although there were a couple conditions where he added hops to see if he could maximize hop character, but that's getting off in the weeds. Go listen to that episode with Ricky Molitor if you're interested in that. But it's, so yeah, you're starting with the mash itself as a way to get it in. A mash hop, maybe there's enzymes that are active in the hops that are going to pull out some of those precursors even more from the malt. And so it's going to be sitting in there. And in their bound form too, these things are very stable. As my understanding is they don't volatilize off very easily during the boil. So they're just around all the way through to the end of the beer. I think even Cecile mentioned that. So you've got all of the steps in the brewing process where we might be able to do something to increase our thiol character, which I think is pretty interesting when you think about it. We really are sort of just scratching the surface of thiol chemistry and getting that flavor into beer.
Right. And Scott Janish has a really good article that's going over kind of all of the methods, and I encourage people to look it up. It's a really long, in-depth article, and he references some research, and I think there's some Omega research that he references there. And one of the things that I learned in that article was that Czech Sots is one of the highest levels of concentration for bound thiols, and they recommend that as a mash hop because it's a low alpha acid, and the ratio is something like 1/3 of the expected isomerization from a boil is what you'd get in the mash. And so with a lower alpha acid hop, you cannot avoid getting too much bitterness from the mash step. And I believe that they actually recommend mashing in a more like a protein rest level. And something about that's like the ideal enzymatic range to start to get some of these bound thiols into solution. And I think they even recommend waiting to add your acid until you get to saccharification, because then the ideal pH range was there too. Do you want to, before we talk about other ways we can get more bound thiols into solution, did you want to maybe touch on the study from last week's, what they found about pH?
Yeah, I was about to say that's a great segue into the pH piece of this, right? Because the big takeaway that they found is that the pH of beer is really bad for this enzymatic reaction that they're studying, right? The beta lyase breaking down the free thiols from their bound precursors. And what they found is the ideal pH is like water pH, or like around 7. So normal beer pH, I mean, between is finished beer is like around 4.2, 4.5, something like that. Sour beer much lower, but then mash pH is like 5.6, 5.5, 5.2 to 5.6. That's the general range that everybody quotes all the time. But 5.2 and 5.6, that's 1 degree of pH change is an order of magnitude of change, right? So that's a huge amount of additional change change in pH, and you're a lot closer to that 7. So maybe at higher pHs, before you add acid, if you're up at that 5.6 or 5.8 range, maybe you actually will get more enzymatic activity, which, and again, I think that was really, really cool for them to see. Is like, okay, why, if you think about like, if you're looking at a concentration standpoint, when you're just, looking at what is beer brewing yeast able to do with thiols, you can look at, okay, here's the number of bound precursors. You can spike it into solution. Here's bound thiols that we're putting in. We'll put some yeast in there in beer and then let it do its thing and measure how many bound precursors are left, right? And that tells you exactly what the yeast is liberating. And they're seeing less than 1% being liberated at beer pHs. Crank that thing up to 7, suddenly you're seeing like almost 2%, which is like 2 or 3 times the amount of thiol character.
Yeah, it's so cool how this all is coming together for me, right? Like this study makes a lot of sense. It reinforces that waiting to add the acid, because we know in most water sources, in most grist, especially with no roasted malts involved, you're going to have a higher pH than ideal from a mash pH perspective. But it sounds like it's a good sweet enough spot to really maximize that bound thiol precursor. And I will say that the amount that you can add is pretty high. Something like on a 5-gallon batch homebrew level, like half a pound to pound of Sots. So if you want to get a lot of precursor in there, you're adding a ton of mash hops. And it was just like, this is crazy. And so in the side-by-side that I did, where I fermented half with thiolized Chico and then half with straight Chico, you would never have known it was mashed hop with Sots in the straight Chico batch. So clearly something's going on here. And what we're learning is the key is yeast. Is no matter how much bound precursor you put into solution, if you don't have the right yeast, you're really not going to get anything out of it. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And because yeasts are going to have different levels of enzymatic activity, right? They're going to, just like the diastatic strain is a great example, right? That diastatic, it's called a diastatic strain because it releases enzymes that break down those dextrins that other brewing yeast don't, right? So that's a great example. There are some yeasts that have their gene expression that they express a lot more of those beta lyase enzymes, which increases thiol expression in the beer. So yeah, it's very much dependent on yeast, which is interesting. And that was not something that Cecile and Guillaume looked at in their study. But again, pH plays such a big role, right? And so I think like you start to look at this and go like, wow, I mean, okay, maybe if we could, I mean, we'll talk about this one too, because it's a good time to talk about it. And then maybe we'll hit our break. Is the thing with the hop tea solution, right? Is like, okay, you've done this research and you say, okay, right, no extraction or bad release of bound thiols at beer pH, but at pH 7.7, we get a lot. And then so it's like, well, water's at 7.7. What if we just soak some hops in water and see if we can get more of these thiols out of solution? And of course they tried that. And there was some pretty interesting results there. Of course, one big thing with hops that we've heard of before is hops are high in polyphenols. And it turns out that polyphenols really inhibit this enzymatic reaction. So you got to get rid of the polyphenols and add a fining agent like PVPP. Well, and of course, the reason you'd add the fining agent is because protein polyphenol complex creates haze. So you can take out the protein or take out the polyphenol and there's no haze. PVPP attacks that polyphenol. So you can take that and it takes the polyphenol out of solution. Anyway, nerded out a little bit there. But add this fining agent to get the polyphenols and then you can ostensibly get release of thiols at this water pH of 7.7. And unfortunately, it didn't work. So they didn't see any additional release at that pH. But that's something to think about. I mean, there's got to be other factors that are influencing it, like maybe presence of cofactor, maybe presence of other things that exist in beer and wort that might work at that mash pH.
This was a huge aha moment for me because one of the recommendations in the chasing the thiols game that we've heard is don't over dry hop these beers. Dare you even lightly dry hop them, because what they're saying is that if you heavy dry hops that we've typically used in the industry for especially hazy IPAs as well as West Coast IPAs, is that you can actually knock out some of the thiol content out of solution. My assumption it was just masking it, right? And it's like, well, why'd you go through all this effort if you're just going to knock it out with a big dry hop? So lighten up on those dry hops is the recommendation. This science is demonstrating why that's happening. That in fact, to me, it seems like it's the polyphenols associated with a heavy dry hop are, doing damage to all the hard work we did to try to get those bound precursors unlocked and into the beer.
Yeah, and again, another thing about this is it's not just the polyphenols. There's probably other things in hops. I mean, I think Cecile and Guillaume were suggesting that when they removed the polyphenols, there's still not a lot of release, which suggests that there may be other things in hops, like, I don't know, I think they mentioned some, maybe iron and copper or like carbonyls working, doing things. Anyway, I don't remember exactly which parts of it they mentioned, but there are other things in hops that might be inhibiting this release. So yeah, maybe throwing a big dry hop addition is not what you need to do if you want to maximize thiol character.
On the flip side, there is a relationship with dry hopping and pH increase. And so it is, however, the big dry hop loads are inching that pH back up to the ideal range to a certain extent.
Right. Inching it back up, but just a little, not probably enough to get it back into those ranges. I mean, you may get up to 4.4, 4.5, 4.6, something like that, but not back up anywhere close to that 7.7 that they found ideal. But that's two things right off the top that are really cool takeaways and sort of explain what you're hearing from brewers and why brewers are doing the things that they're doing, right? Mash hopping because that's the right pH, waiting to add your acid because you're at a higher pH, and then going light on your dry hop because there's other things with hops that are inhibiting or maybe reacting with those thiols. So that's pretty cool. And again, this is one of those reasons why this is how that science informs the things that we do as brewers. And there were a couple other things that they looked at, like presence of cofactors, a presence of an acceptor. Don't worry, we'll talk about that in just a minute. And some other things like does media influence it, and other factors that Cecile and Guillaume looked at, which we'll take a look at right after the break.
One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
On the first episode of The Brewlosophy Show on YouTube, Martin used Lunar Crush, a thiolized yeast strain from Omega, and Phantasm Powder, mash hopping, and pretty much everything he could do to maximize thiol character. But when he served the beers to tasters, they couldn't tell a difference. So maybe there is something this idea, Jordan, that getting thiol character can be difficult, and there are a lot of things that you've got to think about, right?
Yeah, or maybe there's so many free thiols already in a cold IPA that it's kind of tough to tell the difference in a blind comparison.
Oh, that's interesting too. I don't know that I've seen a study yet that's looked at like, diminishing returns, right? I mean, Tom Shellhammer and Scott LaFontaine's diminishing returns from dry hop additions. Maybe it's the same thing. Like once you hit some critical level of thiols, our nose just blanks it. I mean, I know that's a thing with skunky character, right? I know it is because it happens to me. It's like once I get hit with skunky character, my brain just blanks it out, and I can drink Heineken and, Coronas and skunky light struck beer all day. Without any issues. So maybe it's the same.
Yeah, and I think that he gets the first 2 right, the second 2 wrong, and then the 5th one right in his semi-blind personal triangle tests. And so that kind of exposes too, like, I'm sure you've had this experience, like the more you taste your triangle samples, the more you can't tell the difference, even with a starkly different, variable. Triangle tests are hard, and it just goes to show, like, some things side by side in 2 glasses that you understand the difference. You think you can tell a difference, but when you go blind, it can get really tough. And I thought that was fascinating that they were 1 short of achieving significance on the taster panel for a thiolized cold IPA.
Yeah, I feel the same. Yeah, I mean, triangle tests are difficult, right? And every time I do one, I'm always like, yeah, but anytime somebody's like, oh, I tried these 2 beers side by side and I can absolutely tell a difference. And it's like, all right, yeah, do a triangle and see if you can. Because it's tough. It is really tough. And like you said, the more I drink the beers and go back and forth between the triangle, the more it just all gets mixed together in my palate, especially for those ones that are close. I was honestly surprised at Martin's results because, I've never used Phantasm powder, but I've used those thiolized G strains from Omega, and yeah, I get a strong thiol character in those beers. But yeah, I mean, what we're learning from this research with Cecile and Guillaume is that there's a lot of things that go into this, and so maybe something that, like you said, maybe there's a critical mass, or maybe the pH was wrong, or, maybe there's something else that's at play here. And so let's jump back into their study and sort of talk about like what they found. We mentioned that pH plays a factor, right? So the pH of beer is generally not great for thiol release. And then we mentioned that, okay, well, they thought, well, what if we pre-treat the hops in a solution of water or whatever that's at pH 7.7, and see if, and also take out polyphenols and see if we can release extra thiols from the beer. And so I wanted to start right there with the hop tea too, because it was something I didn't get a chance to ask Cecile and Guillaume, but it was something I was thinking about. What if we changed the medium, right? Instead of using like water and hops at that point, what if we used like wort and raised the pH of the wort with like calcium carbonate? So what if you change the underlying substrate? Because the second half of their research was talking about this stuff about cofactors and an acceptor. And those two things were significant in their research. Adding a cofactor in and adding an acceptor in increased the release of bound thiols. Not hugely, but significantly enough. And I think the best thiol release that they saw in the experiment was when they added both the cofactor and the acceptor to beer, and that got the highest thiol release in their entire experiment. So there are ways to increase and promote thiols, and I think it was just really interesting. And one of the reasons why I wanted to start there too is like talking about those ways to increase and promote thiol character.
So could you mash at a pH of 7 and still make fermentable sugars? Or would it be possible to like just use all the enzymes out there, exogenous enzymes, and have this like crazy high mash pH, yet you use other things that make fermentability still happen downstream?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would say yes, because I think there's some brewlosophy experiments where we like mashed at a crazy high pH, but I want to say it was like 6 or 6.5, maybe not like 7. But I don't know. Maybe we should try it and see if that works. I mean, surely there's some research out there. I mean, again, pH, it doesn't mean the enzymes are inactive, at the pH. I mean, I don't want to get too far off into the weeds of this, but there's a term I love whenever I hear enzymes is to talk about like a Zwitter ion. So amino acids are both acidic and basic on the same molecule. And that's why pH is important, because at different pHs, one end of the molecule is more active than the other. And so that causes the amino acid to bind and do different things, enzymes to react differently, blah, 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 all thereon. So if you want another cool term, Zwitter ion, that's a fun one. To share with trivia if you're on a Wednesday or Thursday night bar trivia. Maybe it'll come up at some point. Maybe it won't. But that does sort of relate to this whole cofactor and acceptor thing. And again, I don't want to get too far off into the weeds, but essentially a cofactor is something that helps the enzymatic reaction occur. And so zinc is one that helps with the mash. And we've heard about adding zinc, to the mash. Adding zinc to fermenting beer, and that helps with fermentation. Same thing with this PLP, right? Pyroxidol 5-phosphate helps increase the conditions where enzymatic release would be. But then with the G adduct, that's the one where you have to lop off two things, right? Off the top of it, the G part of that molecule has to have some place to go, and if it doesn't have a place to go, it's gonna like hold on tight, right? It's like not gonna let go of the molecule unless it's got a soft place to land. And so adding these two things in, a cofactor and an acceptor, gives the enzyme supercharges the enzyme. It makes it helpful. It makes it more helpful. It gives it allows higher expression of bound thiols. And that's exactly what they found in this study, which I thought was really interesting. So this is now, I mean, these things are available, probably not to home brewers, but they're available to commercial brewers in some way. And I'm starting to wonder too, when you see these like thiol enzyme releasing products out there, right? are all three of these things mixed together? Is this like, again, science that influenced those thiol releasing products that are available?
Yeah, beats me. I don't know.
Right. Have you used any of the, any of these products to have you had a chance to use like Phantasm powder or any of that stuff, or used any of these products to increase thiol character?
I have not used Phantasm. I have had some commercial Phantasm beers, and I swear I get a bit of like a grape twang. Have you tried one yet?
I have not tried Phantasm. No.
And I wonder if it's just all like, in my mind, and that it's like, well, I'm expecting grapes, and so I've got to have some sort of bias to confirm that they're there. And so that would be an interesting piece of feedback if anyone from the Phantasm or those that have used it. Is there actually a grape flavor that comes along with these, or is it simply the thiol that you're getting? But it appears to work because it's weird, not in a bad way, but it's there.
Yeah. I mean, I've never had Phantasm powder, but I have tried this. It was an experiment that I did. It was it's called Endozyme Thiol. It's from AEB, and it's a wine enzyme that's intended to release thiols in wine. And they don't tell you exactly what enzymes and additives are in there. But it's like, but you add it, and allegedly it releases a whole bunch of thiols. And Federico Tondini, we talked about it on one of the episodes of the Brew Lab. He had great results where the beers were actually getting thiol release character using this enzyme. Now, I didn't have that same result whenever I brewed the beer. Tasters, whenever I brewed it, I used the thiol releasing enzyme, and tasters weren't able to tell a difference. But that's starting to make me, like you, Jordan, I'm starting to put together all these different factors, right? Like, okay, maybe something was missing. What was missing? Was the pH just wrong? Was the, this presence of an acceptor or a cofactor, or was the medium wrong? Does it need to be do we need to pre-treat our hops in some way? Maybe if I had made a hop tea with the enzyme, maybe that would have done a good job of releasing the bound precursors. But in wine's at a very low pH, right? Wine's like near sour beer pH. So maybe we should be playing around with thiol sour beers.
Yeah, and I know Scott Janish has messed around with some of this stuff, like the grape powders and wine yeast that are used in Sauvignon Blanc production. And I think that he's even reported that it's just not a great yeast for a beer brewer. And so I think that maybe he's kind of tossed in the towel on that one. But so the one time I made a thiolized beer, I did Mecca grade wind malt, Gateway, I think is what they call that, which is under modified, which is supposed to be a good source of precursor. I did mash hopping with Sots, and then I did a lower level dry hop than I would normally do that was accompanied with the thiolized Chico from Omega, and it sure worked, and it was too much for me. So I think that going forward, maybe I wouldn't use the modified wind malt, or maybe I'd cut down the undermodified wind malt. Maybe I'd blend it with like a quarter of the grist would be that, and the rest would be standard Pilsner malt. Maybe I would use less mash hopping, or frankly, maybe I would just make a normal beer and just use this yeast and not try to like get all these extra bound precursors into solution, and just get a little bit that would kind of naturally happen from a normal brewing process. For my palate, it's like even the thiolized lagers I've had, you're starting to see them. It's just a little weird. Maybe it's just I just haven't enough time with them yet. Maybe it's an acquired taste I haven't acquired yet.
Yeah, maybe we'll get there at some point where we'll start to like them. But again, I mean, maybe also you're sensitive to them, right? I mean, it could also be that like a low level of thiol character is enough for you to get all the fruity flavor. And we talk all the time about, like you said, like at places where it's just Bud Light drinkers, right? I mean, making beer more approachable is to take the bitterness away and add fruity flavors, right? I mean, that's a way to make beer more drinkable. So this could be something that we start to see in the future. And it's really interesting to me to think about how, again, what tools do brewers have to do this? And it sounds like they have a whole bunch of tools. And now we're adding on, again, and the acceptor, the cofactor, maybe making, pre-treating the hops. And we're starting to sort of scratch the surface and see where it goes. And that's kind of where I'm wondering. I mean, this is kind of a rhetorical question, but like, where is this going to go in the future? We've now got Thiol Boost, Phantasm, all this research that's coming out about how to maximize thiols. Where's this going to go?
Yeah, I'm really curious to see if this trend sticks around? Like, will it be like Brut IPA, gone before we know it? Or will it be like Hazy IPA, where it's truly an industry titan? And maybe how many BJCP IPA styles do we have at this point? You know, like maybe thiolized IPA is the next new style.
IPA or tropical IPA. I don't know exactly what you'd call it. Who knows?
Right. And what's the market language that we need to be using as an industry? Because you know, I think at a certain point you start to turn consumers off when you get overly technical. I mean, let's face it, the vast majority of beer consumers are not Cade and Jordan that care about the science. You know, when I talk to my normal friends that aren't brewers, you know, their eyes start rolling pretty quickly if you mention something fairly similar, like the variety of the hops that you're using. So once we start to get into heady chemistry and stuff, like I'm not convinced that consumers are willing to be along for the ride. I think instead making great beer that people enjoy without having to read a textbook to understand it is the way to go.
Of course. Yeah, well, and of course, and that's the whole point of this show, right? Is to try to get people, you try to get this information out there in a way that people can digest it and come back to it and process it if they need to. But you made a good, interesting point there too, right? We talked about mash hopping, we talked about changing the pH, we talked about lower dry hop level, all these things. But what about the hop variety itself? That's like a whole different, not different, but it's a whole other aspect of this. And because there are hops, like you said, like Sots is high in bound precursors. Another super popular American new aroma hop, Cascade, is also high in bound precursors of these. And I mean, if you think about, Citra and Mosaic and some of these hops that are high already in free thiols, what are those hops going to taste like whenever you start releasing more bound thiols? And where does this direction go? I mean, one of the things that's really cool about hops, and this was told to me by a wine researcher, is that the amount of free thiols in hops is several times the amount of free thiols that are present in grapes. Okay, so if you want to get thiol character out of grapes, you have to use a yeast that has high thiol character. You've got to use something like enzymes, like the endozyme thiol, to get it out of that grape character, to get that grape character really strongly expressed. But in beer, we're playing with borrowed money. It was also, so I heard this from a wine researcher, and also we talked about it a lot with Tom Nielsen on, I can't remember, episode 75, something like that, back in, when we talked about breeding hops for thiol character. We're playing with all of this borrowed money. We have, hops have the ability to increase the amount of free thiols that are present in hops that can be added directly whenever you dry hop. So start increasing, breeding for new hop varieties. They're going to have increased free thiol character, adding in GMO yeast, adding in phantasm powder, thiol boost, mash hopping, lower dry hop levels. And holy moly, we can really start to pack a whole bunch of thiol character into the beer. And that's not even scratching the surface that thiols are super potent already. So small changes in thiol character can result in huge sensory impact.
I'm recalling the IBU wars of the 2010s. And I think that we learned from that more is not necessarily better. And we've dialed back our bitterness in IPAs. And I think that we're making the best IPAs that the world has ever seen right now. And so I can't help but wonder if that all of this stylization research in the laboratory and in the brew house is going to reveal that maybe there is a sweet spot, and maybe you don't want to push every single knob to 11.
Mm-hmm. I mean, come on, this is America. This is everything is better. More is better here. More. That's all we need. I think that's right. We don't need to turn the knob to 11 every time that we brew. So I think you're definitely going to see that. And I think what this paper does again is scratch at the surface of just some of those different tools that brewers have. And I really appreciate that they took the perspective. They're scientists, right? They're chemists, and they're in model media for a lot of the studies, but they're taking the perspective of a brewer, and you don't really see it, right, in the paper. And that's kind of why I was like really excited about pulling this back out, because looking at pH, looking at whether you need to add in an acceptor and stuff, that just means these are the ways that brewers should be thinking about maybe maximizing thiol character, right? Again, you've got Tom Nielsen, the Hop Research Council, all the breeding efforts that are going there to increase free thiols, but there's a huge untapped potential of bound thiols. And who knows, maybe we might start finding some new thiols, or start figuring out like, hey, this particular hop variety, when you add this, particular acceptor and cofactor, it smells awesomely like, I don't know, pineapples or something. I mean, who knows, right? I mean, some amazing character that you really like, or maybe it smells like nothing we've ever smelled before, and it's a new latest, greatest hop variety. You never know.
Yeah, and I think that's a really cool idea for further research, is starting to link the chemistry with the sensory, right? So maybe there are certain thiols that are great in certain concentrations. And so finding those sweet spots would be really great to demonstrate tasters really, they can't notice it until X, and they love it at Y. And by the time you get to Z, they're turned off and it's no longer a pleasurable experience. And really starting to understand the different thiols and their ideal concentrations. And then on the front end, how do we achieve those ideal concentrations to make the best thiol product possible?
Yeah, I wonder if there's been any research that's looked at those things. It'd be pretty interesting to see, right? Like just spike thiols at different concentrations, serve them to tasters and see what it tastes like. Be a really interesting one, especially with all the thiol research that's out there. And again, I'd want to even like look at different varieties. Right? I mean, if you're using like, Citra or Mosaic or Nelson Sauvin or, any of these varieties that may be higher in free thiol character, how do those compare then even to like Cascade with, a whole bunch of released bound thiols? You've got all these different things that you can look at between variety, between how to add it. And that was really cool. And one of the things I really appreciated, again, about Cecile and Guillaume's research. Well, Jordan, we talked about a bunch of stuff, and hopefully we stayed a little bit out of the science for people, although I did get a little nerdy a couple of times. If you got any questions about structure or any of this stuff, just let me know. I'll read it as feedback. Is there anything else that you wanted to cover before we... wait, we got to ask this. I always ask this. What's your takeaway after you've listened to the episode and we've talked about all of this?
I think we still have a lot to learn, but scientists like these in the last episode are really uncovering the ways to boost thiol in beer. And I think that, it just continue researching and continue brewing, and let's continue to figure this out.
Yeah, exactly. And researchers like Cecile and Guillaume, if you're listening, please continue doing this research. And hey, the other thing is if you're out here brewing and using any of these techniques that you hear, I want to hear from you too, because that'd be great to know what is the real world application and what's the real world experience that you're doing whenever you hear this research. So let us know. Anything else you wanted to add, Jordan?
Yeah, and if you have any thiolized beers that you think really demonstrate how amazing of a product this is, send it our way. We'd love to try them.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Jordan and I will be back in 2 weeks with our next Applying the Science episode. And until then, be sure to check out the Brewlosophy podcast, the Hop Chronicles Short and Shoddy, Brew It Yourself Experiments, and the all-new Brewlosophy show at brewlosophy.com. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.